David Gonzalez, what's up?
Life is pretty great, Joe. It's good to be here with you.
That's awesome. Yeah, yeah, we go way back. It's kind of funny. I was listening to some of our old podcasts and your old podcast, The Point of Struggle, recently, and I was reminiscing, and I was like, oh, well, I have to have another chat. So,
No,
what
I'm
are we
glad you I'm
talking?
glad you hit me up. Yeah, I think one of the things that I enjoy the most is our conversations. Part of it is because I feel like most of my biases are reflected. So, there's always that nice component.
Hmm.
Um, but I also appreciate just the willingness to kind of dig into the nuances of not just necessarily where we disagree, but like the nuance of the situations that we've confronted. Um, yeah, so I'm looking forward to this. This should be a really enjoyable conversation.
Yeah, I totally agree. So, yeah, I think first things first. Since our interview, the last one a bit ago, you've now had some pretty major changes with respect to your company. Do you want to go into that for a second?
Yeah, yeah. So what, 4 years ago, went full time on what to that point had been about 2 years of a kind of mornings and weekends passion project that became Zeff, our company that I co-founded with Ben Taylor and Bronze Swallow. And, we got into that. And this February, we sold that company to Dan Robot, um, which was, I don't know, like I tell people, and I think, especially other founders, they understand this. Um, there's always an enjoyment to building something, and there's a reality around the chaos of that kind of effort that typically calls to certain kinds of people. And because of that, it's fair to say that most people don't start a company because of money.
Hmm.
First off, you go without money for a very long time.
Right.
Um, and there's no guarantee on what's going to be the upside, if anything. I mean, most of us understand that the most likely outcome is catastrophic failure. And so, letting go of that company essentially to join another company to sell it, it's a bit of, it's kind of bittersweet. Uh, Definitely have admired and always appreciated the work that's being done over at Data Robot. And to join them was not that hard a decision. Like, they're a good group. But yeah, there's kind of mixed emotions around all that because frankly, I'm not very good at having a real job, man. So
Yeah, yeah, me neither. I think yeah, we're you and I are both like kind of classically unemployable in some ways, so we do our best to wear the straight face and uh, yeah, it's yeah, I could definitely empathize with that. I mean, someday who knows what's going to go on with my company, Ternary Data, but yeah, I'm definitely stoked to see that you had a successful exit because
yeah,
the
yeah.
alternatives, especially at the time that you announced the sale. I mean, that was also around the time when like the entire world was falling apart because of
It's
COVID. So
true. Yeah. I mean, I got a lot of undeserved respect from my investors for my, sage outlook on the future. And some of it was very much teasing, like, yeah, no one could have called it this good. But yeah, it definitely made for different kinds of things to adjust to, and it would have been a very difficult year to run, an enterprise-facing product-based startup in 2020, where we were in our product market fit. It would have been hard, not impossible. We probably would have survived, but it would have been very hard. And so, yeah, yeah, they thought I had all kinds of forecasting abilities that I probably don't have.
it's hilarious. Yeah, yeah. I feel the same way. But uh, I mean, I remember back when COVID was hitting, even in January, just because I have close ties to Asia. Like I was
Yeah,
telling people, yeah, we're going to be canceling our conferences going into spring, and
yeah,
um, but I'd also been in Wuhan in early December of 2019, so I was like, when I saw that that city got shut down, I just thought, well, okay, like that's like shutting down New York City, and China doesn't shut down for anything. So when that's shut down, there's a problem. Um,
Yeah.
and so we started getting ready, but everyone was thinking, wow, you're
Well,
crazy.
and I
Like,
think your input was super calibrating to me at the beginning of the year. The decision had already been made, so I didn't feel like
mhm.
I had motivation. Like I didn't have different motivations, but yeah, I definitely cued off of your understanding heavily because I'm like, I
Oh,
don't know what's going on. I don't have visibility, but yeah,
right.
when you told me about Wuhan, I didn't know, I didn't even know the name, but you're like, yeah, it's like New York City shutting down. I'm like, whoa, okay, that's,
Yeah, it's a bit different. Plus, I had Asian connections over there, so it just had very early warning signals that a lot of people didn't. So,
yeah,
when you have people taking things seriously over there, it's kind of it's going to be an issue, and especially when flights aren't shut down. You're like, it's only a matter of time before this affects, you know,
yeah.
everywhere. So,
Well,
yeah,
and
that's interesting.
morbidly, I reinstalled Pandemic on my phone and started playing that game again.
You're a sick person. That's funny.
I am. I really
Yeah,
like dark humor. It's my absolute favorite.
yeah, that's awesome. Same. Yeah, and it's interesting. I mean, some of the things that you had noticed in the space, I would say around the fall of 2019, going on in the AI space and how that would affect companies like Zeff. I mean, can you go into that for a bit? And it's
Yeah, so I think the things at ZAF that were a little bit, well, probably a lot bit ahead of the curve, even to this day. We may have been way early on
mm,
kind of the incorporation of, you know, image, audio, video data into like an enterprise style problem, especially like a generalized approach. That was probably going to be a hard slog. Uh, but something that I continue to see as kind of plaguing our industry is, to kind of borrow. Let me just kind of share a common vignette. You go into Stack Overflow or anywhere, and someone's going to show you an example of 3 lines of code and a model build, and 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 when you put that before like data scientists or others, they fixate on like lines 2 and 3, like, oh, I built a model, like, well, I think I could build a better model, or is it a deep learning model? Like they start obsessing about minutia, hyperparameter, tuning, and all that kind of stuff. And then step 3, you can use it. It's like, well, can you actually use it? And I would agree that the bookends of this problem are probably the most important to focus on. Can you use the model? For the first time, generally, I'm hearing the word like ML ops being reflected back you know, from the market, almost unprompted. And, I've been wondering when I would hear that, like sometime in the last decade. I'm like, so when are people going to talk about deploying models? Because
mhm.
in my experience, and I think I've told you this, this story, my buddy Mark, who wasn't the CTO, but he was the SVP of engineering at a marketing and advertising firm that I worked at. I brought in like a dog and pony show over something that we built in R, and his response at the end of this meeting that was like all cheers and backslaps, and like, whoa, we're gonna kill it. It was just quiet. He was just sitting there quietly near me at this giant conference room. And as we're walking out, I'm literally getting backslaps of like, this is amazing. He's like, hey, you got time for lunch? I'm like, sure. So we go out to lunch, and he says, look, man, I know you're smart. I don't know what you do. I don't understand it very well. Um, but I know this much. If any one of my engineers had ever demoed something that literally only worked on their laptop, I'd fire his ass on the spot.
Wow. Yeah.
And my countenance fell, and I was like, oh. He's like, no, like, I think there's a path forward for you, man, but like that R language, I've never heard of that. Like, I've been in this industry for a long time, like since the early 90s, and I've never heard of that. And if I've not heard of it, it's probably not real. And he's like, so like, let me help you learn a language, like a real language, and then let's find you tools that like we can actually use so that my team can use what you built. And, initially he taught me Ruby, which was a little bit of a dead end. There was like, this is like 2010. So I guess a decade ago, 2009, 2010, there were actually some data manipulation or at least numerical libraries in Ruby. But they weren't that strong and they were all academic. And so, Googling, I found Python and, NumPy and SciPy and stats models. And I was like, oh man, this is great. So I could stop using bugs, I could stop using R, and I could just use Python. And I think it was about 60 days later that I had my first little like API endpoint thing that ran. And it was a model. And it was like a watershed moment for me, Joe. Like to see a model actually get used by engineers when I wasn't around was like, well, this is game over. Like, why would I ever do anything else? And yeah, so like that has been framing for most of my a big chunk of my professional career has been like, why don't we talk about that? But the other bookend of this problem is that first line of code always says like, build a model from something like, let's call it dataset.csv. So some wonderful artifact that just by the grace of all that is good exists. It's just like, oh, this neat and tidy thing that just, all you had to do is just name this file and you're off to the races. For even longer than the last 10 years, and everything that I've done in analytics, I have never been handed a dataset.csv that didn't come from an academic circle that was ready to use. Like
That's
never
so
once.
True. It's still the crux to this day.
That
initial data
like
set, right? So, because it's funny, because you look at any of the libraries and it's like, oh, train X and X train and Y train, and yeah, it's just that easy. Except X train usually refers to a data set that's hopefully been cleaned, but that's a lot of work. So,
well, and even if it's been cleaned, it belies the fact that it may not be machine ready.
yeah.
And that's the other part of this. It's like, we're coming from a world where data is typically the domain of subject matter experts and people who rely upon the information streams, kind of to borrow Larry Ellison. It's like most companies today run their business on information. They could probably do a better job. They could probably use more elegant tools. They could probably, insert XYZ platform, and who knows, it might help. But most of them are running their business on information. But if you want to feed something like, air quotes AI or actual AI or some, but machine learning models of any stripe, you can't just feed it BI data. Right. And so it's that information stream is hugely inadequate.
That's an interesting one. I mean, you and I have quite a bit of experience trying to do ML on BI data. Maybe walk us through some of the things that you've seen and some of the challenges with using BI data for machine learning.
Yeah. So I think it's probably my temperament, but I also think I'm not an idiot. So I tend to see things in like barbell patterns, and I'm always surprised when something's a little bit more evenly distributed or kind of like falls out as like, oh, it's kind of random. So BI data exists in a barbell configuration where often, whether it's a lake or just log files that exist in some kind of disorganized fashion, where there's literally data strewn about somewhere. And it becomes somebody's job to pipe it to somewhere where you could generate a report from it. Sometimes that's done with, a ton of elegance, and you're like, wow, this is a really beautiful data warehouse. Like, and I've had like the joy of consuming data out of data warehouses that quite literally made me feel a little emotional. Like I'm looking at this star schema and I'm realizing I can, like use any dimension, or I can author a dimension and it'll just work. And things are responsive. I'm like, wow, like I'm not going to tell them, but like, this is going to be fun, like, but that's, that's like the 5th percentile. 95% of the time, it's like, it's an operational data store. Like, there's junk data somewhere, like not junk data, but like not readily consumable, not organized, not anything that anyone would use. And then what people need, what people need because it exists in the database. And it exists in the database in the format that they consume it, or really close to it, which means that it has been aggregated or partitioned or disaggregated, like to a degree that makes it utterly useless as a training data set.
Yeah, I always found it's an interesting one. In the example you say where the 5%, where there's a nice clean Kimball data set. The challenge I've always seen with that is if you're trying to do machine learning on that, we'll talk about types of machine learning in a bit, but typically a lot of the business questions you have are inherently answered in that BI data set precisely because it's a BI data set. So
that was going to be my other point, is that like, so it's like, we can have this almost esoteric argument about like dataset.csv becomes model and gets deployed. But the real question is like, are you doing an AI project or are you solving a business need? And way too much I see we're doing AI projects. And the problem is because there's an unreasonable like expectation and multiplier on the perceived value by the market of a company that quote does AI.
For sure.
So they have every incentive to like, by hook or by crook, shoehorn an AI project into what they do and say we do AI, and then slap AI next to their name, or like, and have a brain with like, like a fuzz around it and some cybernetic network on their homepage. And you scroll through, you're like, what does this company do? It looks really like it's like the future. And you find out that, it's like they do lead gen.
Right. And their AI is a bunch of group by statements. So yeah, can't even count how many times I've seen that happen. It's interesting. I mean, for business data, I would say that there's a few core data science-y requisites. Like forecasting, I think, is one where you can argue like any business who's reached a mature state, forecasting your data is probably a good idea depending on the vertical you're in. If you're in supply chain, absolutely. If you're in marketing, very good idea. Clustering, perhaps, although that could also be done by group wise, depending on how your data is categorized. And then probably something like churn and retention or other types of analytics where machine learning could be handy, depending on how you're going about these your modeling. I mean, if you're using survival analysis, that's not really a machine learning approach. It's just curves. But if you're doing, multivariate type machine learning, then sure, that's legit. But a lot of the use cases we would get were more along the lines of like, I need to know what customers have left our business or something. And I'm like, well, that's a query, but sure, we can make it more elaborate, I guess, if you want.
Yeah.
So
no, I would 100% agree. And I would say that like, if you're wanting to provide business value with AI, like anymore, I feel like it really should be a horse race, because you're working on an established problem where you can appreciate a basis point or a single percentage delta, like, because you're calibrated already to that understanding. You can literally do the total cost of ownership based on a basis point. You're like, it may not be enough to shoulder the cost of a team or a headcount or a product or a vendor or whatever, or an effort, but you probably have somewhere a spreadsheet that somebody can go click. That's what a basis point win would do.
right.
Right. And outside of those things, that's a science project. Like, and so it should be a horse race, and you should be, and I would think most companies should be more open to running that horse race on the metrics that matter, where a basis point win can be appreciated, and looking for other parts of the business where they could enact forecasts to better align efforts in their organization. But outside of that, probably not. Probably not
Hmm.
needed.
Yeah, I would even imagine at a place like Data Robot, so the hard part is probably just getting that initial data set that you can feed into Data Robot's awesome AutoML. Am I mistaken on that, or is that a fair assessment?
Oh, well, so Data Robot has been working pretty diligently over, I don't know, the last 5 years. Sorry, there's going to be a sneeze here somewhere.
Okay,
um,
put your mask on.
yeah. Over the last 5 years to really kind of accomplish this vision of data to value. Um, and so in pursuit of that, the AutoML finds itself situated pretty much right in the middle. So through a series of acquisitions like, Parallel M,
Mhm.
Nexosis, and others, they have focused on both deployment and consumption. And then upstream, through a recent acquisition like Paxata, they've focused on, essentially using Spark to better sift through your data and turn it into a training data set. And I think upstream is where a lot of the focus will continue to be. Um, I'm not saying ML ops is a solved problem. It's definitely not a solved problem. Uh, but there's a lot of questions that happen upstream. Like, is this the right problem to be working on? Like,
Mhm.
how big a lift would it require to go from what we have to what we need? And if it's that big a lift, like, what else could we do? Like, and
Right.
not else, what could we do with AI, but like literally, what else could we be working on? Because that's a big lift. Could we take that hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars and apply it to somewhere else with data, and improve our processes, improve our value in the marketplace, improve the product experience, that kind of bit. And yeah, so that's been their focus. And yeah, I mean, it's not a done thing, but I do admire how much effort has been made to kind of think about it as a data to value proposition. But I
Mhm.
do find myself regularly going, like, most businesses, you don't need AI. You need to go from running your like the information stream that matters most in your business being XYZ's expert gut feeling to a more scalable approach to we can actually have dumber people making smarter decisions. Yeah.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I mean, the world I've always wanted was is one where a lot of the unstructured data and structured data is fused. Sort of this omniscient um, predictive capability, and I sense that's probably a long ways off because the amount of
You and I
computation
share that,
required
and
is,
I think
yeah,
we were bitten a little bit with the bug way back at Pure Predictive. Kind of,
yeah,
there was you know, now 10 years on, it's hard to say that if you're way too early that you weren't wrong. It's like, it's hard. You're like, well, probably, like eventually I'll be right, but like if you're too early, then you're probably wrong. And so I think it's fair to say that we had kind of a bit of a consensual delusion amongst
hmm,
all of us that kind of went through that shop. That, man, wouldn't it be great if we could have a single source of truth and essentially have an automated system that went around scouring for things that it could predict.
yeah.
And I still love that vision, but it's 10 years now and we're still working on BI problems and forecasting.
Oh, yeah, I know in my business, I mean, we spend a lot of our time just helping companies migrate their data to the cloud,
Yeah.
and data platforms, et cetera. And that's just
Yeah.
getting the infrastructure question addressed, right? So yeah, I think it's going to be a long time unless there's something out of left field like quantum computing somehow is able to just
Yeah.
help leverage, uh, and also like there's APIs and ways to scrape like every conceivable piece of data through either scraping what's on the internet, cameras and using computer vision and audio to capture everything that's like just going on in the world. And even then, you're probably just capturing a small slice. But I mean, at some point, I envision this is probably going to be a future, but who knows if we'll live long enough to see that at the rate things are going now. But I mean, singularity is supposed to happen in like 9 years or something. So we'll
Yeah. So I mean, maybe it'll like I mean, it is conceivable that something like a step function new reality could happen, but at least from my perspective, I find myself I think mostly agreeing with you, Joe, that like essentially focusing on fundamentals is probably going to have an outsized impact on businesses.
Mhm.
Doesn't mean that there can't be some elegant tooling. It doesn't even mean that you can't do some stuff that you didn't do before, but a lot of business opportunity exists in kind of sound fundamentals. And like you rightfully said, even in the area of like forecasting, like we've had forecasts for 120 years, like reasonable forecasts for 120 years. Thanks Industrial Revolution, like people started
Right.
counting things. And they keep getting sharper, and in the industries and in the the departments where those forecasts are extremely important, it's kind of classic capitalism. A need creates supply.
Mhm.
So a need for good data creates a supply of good data. It takes a while,
Right.
but it exists. And so I almost feel like saying that, like, if you don't have good data to solve this problem, you should probably focus on a different problem.
That is so true. Yeah. Yeah, I know in our experience too. I mean, when to harken back to the operational data storage you're talking about earlier, right?
Yeah.
Operational data, the 95% of data that just may not lend itself to uh, AI, let alone BI. I mean, that's definitely true. Data quality is a huge issue. It's a couple things. It's data quality, but I think it's also like data relevance. So, is this data even going to be useful to this particular question or not? And we saw this in the big data days, I think, when companies would just accumulate as much data as humanly possible to, because you might need it at some point. So it reminded me of like those hoarders shows that you watch where,
Oh,
um,
totally. It was the
yeah,
National Geographic Channel all over again.
yeah, yeah. It's like, oh, I think I'm gonna need like that 5-year-old piece of pizza I have under my couch at some point. I don't know why, but
I don't know why. Yeah. And I probably should never throw cat litter out because you may need it
mhm.
someday. Like,
Yeah, that's like a lot of
I
people's
mean,
data lakes.
the clumps in the litter, you can't throw those out. Those are good. That's gold.
It's
Like,
gold.
someone's going to be digging a million years from now and find those, and it's going to be some new energy source. So we should hold on to it.
That's so true. Yeah, but I think it's still how a lot of companies view the data that they collect. It's just sort of a hodgepodge. And there's some reasoning to it, I suppose, right? Like, oh, we might find insight into it. It reminds me of the argument the NSA used to use actually about, well, we'll just collect everything in a dragnet in case we need to use it someday. And
Yeah.
like, so, but, and
And
storage
then
has
they
gotten really
build
cheap.
a 27 zettabyte something in Bluffdale, and they're like, we'll
Hmm. Just in case we need it.
just in
Um,
case we need it.
Yeah, but storage has gotten so cheap though that we're seeing sort of I would say a renaissance, but it's been an interesting one because data lakes I think are still somewhat in vogue depending on the type of company you're dealing with. But in a lot of cases, people have moved at least the structured and semi-structured data into things like BigQuery and Snowflake,
Yeah.
just because you can just load all your data in there. So you just kind of like what you did is you just basically moved your data from one place to another is all that happened, and you might be able to get quicker query value out of it depending on the technology you're using, but the behavior is still the same at the end of the day.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah. Well, like another thought that keeps kind of rolling around in my head is, so like, I try and see these long run trends. Like, I'm just fascinated by them. Right. And so when I look at these long run trends, I can't help like the inescapable fact that when something's ready for prime time because it has wide scale adoption. And with that in mind, it's like, so who are the core, like I keep wondering, like, who's the killer adopter, like
Mm-hmm.
in the enterprise. And, you know, to name something like a data scientist, you're like, well, that's not even possible, because that bullshit idea was like literally invented less than a decade ago. So like, couldn't be that person because they just showed up. So if it's not them, who else is it? You're like, could be the analyst. I don't think that's I truly believe that there's going to be a resurgence of like analysts are on the ascendant
Mm-hmm.
growth curve, because anymore, like if you've got data that can go into a system, you know, little shameless plug like Data Robot, and turn into a usable model that could literally have an API endpoint attached to it, it's probably not going to be a model. That's probably going to be lots of models and right, data that doesn't go into a system very well. So
Right.
what does that mean? Subject matter expert. Subject matter expert. Oh, you're talking about like a data analyst, like an analyst of some kind. And they're going to consult a lot of different models and a lot of different streams and a lot of industry know-how and a few different phone calls and a text that they got last night. And they're going to say, I think this is going to happen.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think there's a lot of truth to that. We kind of grew up
Meanwhile,
in
the data
the,
scientist is going to try and figure out how to tune a hyperparameter to come up with one more accurate version of one of the models that goes into that person's forecast. It's like, well,
mm-hmm.
useful maybe, but like, I don't know.
I
It's
think it's
kind
useful
of,
depending on the organization you're in. Like if you're, say, working on GPT-3, for example, right? Like that's more of a research problem at that point. So you
totally
get
a research
bright
problem.
minds.
Show me commercial application, and then it's not a research application. You know,
Exactly. And in most businesses, like you're not going to get the GPT-3 group to come work on your forecasting problem at your
no, no.
business. That's
And
not
you
going to
wouldn't want
happen.
them to either, because they took
Mm-mm.
like how long to do that, and they spent $10 million in compute. Like, raise your hand if that sounds like a good idea.
Right. Yeah. But, and then we came up in the era of trying to, I think not only um, uh, partake in the idea of a citizen data scientist, but I think we were also trying to invent um, that role for people, given the
We
work that we
were,
were
yeah.
doing, right? So, AutoML back in the day, and I would say even now it's still a bit nascent, but especially back then, it
Oh,
was almost witchcraft in a way. And but even back then, we were coining the term citizen data scientist or data scientist in a box or something crazy. And it's been interesting because at the same time, there have been very substantial leaps in terms of at least the beginnings of having an automated ML workflow. And so in that time, fast forward to today in the next 5 years, like what does a data scientist do? Or is that even a thing anymore?
So my prediction, like 5 years on from now, my prediction is that data scientists won't go away because mostly because of like market signaling. Like it's just a job that sounds sexy, and people want to say, well, like I have a data scientist. Like literally, like that's a big thing for a CEO to say, like I've got a team of them, or I've got 3 of them, or look at that,
Right.
that's mine over there. So there's something to be said that will probably have it'll have a longer shelf life than I think is probably helpful. But I see it kind of fracturing into three areas and one full departure. So the 3 areas that I see like the role of data scientists fracturing into is, on one side, it's pure data engineering. And in the past, these people came, with different titles, and they still exist. There's DBAs and architects and, you know, uh, lake engineers and all this kind of jazz. I think like I'm very bullish on data engineering. Very,
Mm-hmm.
very bullish. I also see, as I said, an ascendancy in an appreciation and a value attached to an analyst, like not an Excel jockey, not somebody who can just whip out a pivot table like and then move on to the next pivot table, but like
Right.
somebody who actually cares enough about their industry and their market to be able to make a proper, well scoped, like strategically sound forecast. And we both worked in areas where we have either been that person or known those people, and they're really, really valuable. They often get paid quite well too. Like they, and they often do pretty well outside of work as well, because they're like, I know my industry. I guess I'm going to invest according to what's between my ears, not insider knowledge, just know.
Right.
And they tend to be really strong people. So that leaves like the third group, which is a tiny, tiny, tiny group of people who are going to be like algorithms people.
Mm-hmm.
And they're going to do their work in academic and commercial labs. And, like the most dismissive or at least gracious form of that is, gradient descent by graduate student. Like that's what they're doing. And, and there's more lofty versions of that. Like, they're going to be focusing on like, how do we apply quantum computing to this and that kind of stuff. But it's like, that's a slog. And you're literally signing up for like 10 years of schooling to be useful in that department. Like that's not going to attract a huge amount of people, and most people are going to wash out. So,
well, yeah, especially given the salaries that you can, make in industry, after you get your PhD. I mean, the number of postdocs, in the AI academic field right now are dwindling because they're getting poached by the big companies. But at the same time, I mean, there's cool stuff that's coming out of research, like lesson one shot. You saw that paper,
I saw that,
a few weeks ago, and that's cool. I mean, it'll be a bit before that's, I would say, used in industry, but I mean, it's awesome to see that people are thinking about these types of problems and how to make, the ML world a better place.
But I think we know that like invention doesn't scale. Like the type of effort that is required to be inventive, it doesn't scale, and it typically concentrates, and it has a gestation period that is measured in careers.
Mm-hmm.
Like, the good folks in Canada who held on for dear life through all of the nuclear winters, or all of the AI winters, thanks to their tenure track positions, like they literally waited for a 30-year payoff. Like what? Like,
Yeah. And that's a big deal. I mean, and God bless those people that stuck it out.
oh yeah, no, I don't think it's bad.
Yeah.
Yeah, but it's like, but that's not going to be like, that's not going to be even hundreds of people. That's like scores of people that do that kind of work.
Mm-hmm.
So, like, yeah. And if you bet correctly, yeah, sure, you could be, Hinton, LeCun, Bengio, and the rest of them, and finally be making a tremendous amount of money, as well as working on your passion project 30 years on, with scores of graduate students to your name and lots of cool stuff. But there's other research lines that died along the way, and those people are
Lots of them
going to die in ignominy.
Yeah, for sure. And I mean, even when we were early in the ML space, I mean, it was way before deep learning was cool. Or, I actually remember. So there were a couple of things I remember back when we were working together. It was one, don't call it AI because that's unsexy. That's definitely a good way to not get investment, because people were freaked out about the last AI winter, which they're still recovering from. Also, deep learning was, or sorry, neural networks. Even single layer neural networks were considered to be black boxes, overfit, next to useless for machine learning. And I would make an argument, sure, that particular version of a neural net. I mean, there were probably different approaches, but now fast forward, and those same people, they may have been like big proponents of like support vector machines or different approaches like that, or ensemble learning. And now what's interesting is, those techniques they're still used maybe, but they definitely don't have the mind share. So if you spend all your time being like the support vector machine person, and then all of a sudden deep learning sort of comes out of,
Well, I mean, I think I teased, I think I think I said something online specifically with you as my audience, where I said, we're in the middle of an SVM winter.
I know, I caught that immediately. It was, yeah. I chuckled pretty, I think audibly when I read that, because it was, we're an SVM winner. And who's to say, maybe an approach will see the light of day at some point. I'm not quite sure how, but advances of technology being what they are, it's like, who knows? I don't know.
I mean, but if so if we think of like that group focusing on invention, then the question that I think, and where I think it's a departure, it's not one of these, it's not the data scientist, it's not one of these three roles. It's like, So if you're not going to be working on application or invention, what should you be doing? And I can't help but kind of keep cycling back to that conversation with Mark like a decade ago, which is, in essentially very precise software engineering type terms, he was saying something that I've come to believe. Innovation is adopted inventions. Doesn't that sound like more fun? Like to be working on innovation? Like, find some cool invention. Sure, you don't even have to invent it. Just find cool, inventions. And when we think about world-class engineers of every stripe, like they're so good at pulling a grab bag of things together, cobbling together in like this glorious Rube Goldberg machine that, takes in $1 and spits out $1.25. Like that's tech. Well, and in some cases, takes in $1 and spits out $1.85 or $1.90. And it's like, it's literally printing money. And you stand back from it. Like if you stand back far enough from it, it looks awesome. Like it looks elegant. Then you get closer, you're like, oh, it's a Rube Goldberg machine. Like, oh,
Yep.
yeah. And it always is. It doesn't matter who you're working for. It doesn't matter how big the firm. It's like software engineers and software developers are really good at cobbling things together that actually work. And the innovation that's available to people by just putting ML into production where it could be more reliable, better used is huge. It's huge. And I truly believe that's the tip of the iceberg. Is we're looking at like finally people are cobbling together an ML offering that's kind of soup to nuts. But until software developers are using it, it's still like an esoteric argument. It's still kind of like it's an academic argument. Like, yeah, it could be used. It's like it's a cool invention. Once I start seeing it like being widely adopted by software developers, putting it in everything that they do, like that, then this innovation is going to hit the enterprise in a massive, massive way.
Yeah, I think that's a very good point. And that's something you've been working on at Data Robot as well, as the software evangelism piece. I think it's a necessary component because data in and of itself, without embedding it into applications, it's either reports or models that are used by somebody
like
or
insight,
something.
yeah, like essentially insight consumed models, right? You're summarizing the findings and making decisions based on summary stuff.
And those models that are used internally at companies, I mean, they're basically just ways of either automating internal processes that are done in volume or automating the insights that were done provided in a report before, right? So it's, but yeah, and you see this, I think, with companies that are, I think, digital native and data native. So like Google, Facebook, for example, Amazon, like that. Those are examples of companies I would say were like software engineering and data engineering and machine learning or all basically the same thing, because it's basically just embedded in the DNA to the point where if you made an application that didn't have ML in it, I mean, that wouldn't make any sense. Why would you do that? Because you're going to get more, but you also have the volume of users at that point that are generating data in a feedback loop. But we're starting to see this, I think, with startups as well, where even if you don't have the data, more and more I'm seeing startups that are coming out that are thinking ML data alongside the engineering of their product, and they're not separate things, and I think that's really cool because that's pretty good. And it'll be interesting to see what happens to these companies. I mean, we talked earlier about just the gnarliness and the difficulty of starting a business and getting it off the ground, let alone having success with it. So, assuming that these companies can get over that initial escape velocity, just succeeding, it does pose a big threat to, I would say, bigger companies, because these ML embedded software apps can punch way above their weight class compared to some legacy company that's still trying to figure out AI and ML.
Yeah.
That problem of like embedding things, moving to the cloud and digitally transforming, and going through data transformation on top of that, that is a tall order for a lot of companies. It's hard.
Yeah, and you got like a front row seat to some of that, right? And I've been there. Like it hasn't been in the last 5 years, but like even the stuff that I was doing when I was doing freelance work with my little team, it was, I come in with high hopes and ambitions, and it was pretty sobering. Like immediately I'm like, okay, so we're going to get to here. Like, and that's actually going to be a massive win. Like at first I was feeling like resentful and like a waste of time. And over time I realized like, no, like I'd look around at like all of the benefit to the company and to the people and what they could do. And I'm like, oh, that's a massive win. Like digital transformation on so many levels often is a huge boon for an enterprise. And it doesn't have to be a moonshot. Like you don't have to automate everything and fire all your employees for it to be a win.
Yeah, that's so true. That's interesting because that comment too about firing all your employees because you automated everything. I think, to be frank, that was one of the, I wouldn't say goals, but it was one of the side effects that all of us figured that was going to happen with massive ML adoption out of the gate. And I think it's been a bit more slow going than that. If anything, what we found is more augmentation going on with machine learning, where
Yeah.
it more builds on your job versus like it completely eliminates. I mean, for sure, it's eliminating certain jobs and industries, and I think they'll continue. But as well, there's also the augmentation part that I don't know that we'd quite as consider quite as much, because we're just like, well, like, are you a cost center? Then we'll just AI you out of existence, and it's and it's good. I mean, there's definitely a lot of empathy I have with people who are in the types of jobs that could be automated away, and it's
Oh yeah, I
uh,
don't think it's a trivial or a non-existent concern,
yeah.
but especially from like the perspective of leadership inside of an enterprise organization, like the same rules and principles around value generation should just be applied. Like, and you should just be looking around and it's like, where can we literally cookie cutter this solution? And it's like, oh, well, we have time series data. Great. Where do we have time series data? Boom, 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 and just stamp them out. And like, great. Now all our time series forecasts are much, much better because we're using a more elegant but more useful approach. And they go, okay, and where are we routing information and using kind of loosey goosey rules that are
Hmm.
literally hard coded into our code, but we're not robust to novelty. Okay, well, like let's go look at that. We're shifting documents around or deciding who to assign to a certain project, and and all of those to me, like in my reductivist mindset, those all look like lead gen to me. Like that all
Hmm.
looks, and granted, I have a strong bias, but it all just looks like a lead gen problem. So anything that could conceivably, if you squint and look sideways, could be like shoehorned into a lead gen problem. Probably ML is a great thing. Like go put ML on that. Outside of those, like it starts to like the appreciable win and the ability to execute goes down precipitously. And I don't know. I guess I'm just not that optimistic. But
Yeah, I tend to feel the same way. Well, getting close to the top of the hour, are there any is there anything else in your mind with respect to, I guess, the future of machine learning for the next, say, 3 to 5 years?
well, I think So I'll be candid. Like the pragmatist in me that advocates for taking a pretty dismissive approach to AI and enterprise outside of just a few very well scoped things, uh, easily gives over to kind of the just dyed in the wool technologist. I'm going to be looking at the inventions. Like
Mhm.
I don't expect them to hit like the ground in any reasonable time scale, but I'm really excited to see what happens in the academy and in these commercial labs around unstructured data, around blob data, around sensory input data, around embedding ML systems inside of a device that has a sensor array. I can't help but like again squint and look sideways. It's like I have a I have a bias that says that like human consciousness it's a summation of our entirety. Like so the fact that I have my five senses and that I have my brain in between my ears and like all this kind of stuff. And then I get older and all this kind of stuff and I get sleepy and tired. Like that's my consciousness. It is inextricably tied from that experience. And so I look at things where it's like, oh, there's a sensor array and there's some LML in there. It's like, yeah, no, not like, not big C consciousness, but it's like, that starts to look like the path towards something interesting. It probably need a much better and more elegant solution than, you know, these, you know, deep neural networks that we're using that are kind of hot right now, or even capsule networks or anything like a network. But I'll be looking at it because it's cool and it's neat and it's inspiring to see people, you know, spend the entirety of their life trying to make something that doesn't exist. And I love that stuff.
Yeah, same. Yeah, the sci-fi nerd in me comes out, you know, reading all the, I mean, I grew up on old cyberpunk novels and all that stuff back in the you know, the 80s and 90s, and it's fun seeing some of it come true, and I'm anxious for the rest of it to come true. So
Amen.
it's awesome.
Amen on that.
Yeah. Well, Dave, as always, it's been a pleasure talking, and let's do this again soon. So
Absolutely. All right.
yeah, awesome,
Take
man.
care, Jeff.